He made only 3 films. He lived just 24 years. Yet even after 7 decades, James Dean remains the face of rebellion, the eternal symbol of youth, restlessness, and untamed freedom. But behind that cool stare, the cigarette dangling from his lips, and the roar of his Porsche, there was another James Dean, one Hollywood never wanted you to see. In 1955, as his Porsche 550 Spider, the little bastard, sped down a California highway, fate struck without warning. In an instant, the brightest new star in Hollywood was gone. But who was James Dean before the fame, before Rebel Without a Cause and East of Eden turned him into an icon? Behind the legend was a lonely young man haunted by loss, desperate for belonging, and forever at odds with the image the studios built around him. He lived fast, loved recklessly, and carried secrets that were buried long after his tragic end. This is not just the story of a Hollywood star who died young. This is the real life of James Dean, the dreamer, the rebel, the man behind the myth. Because the truth about James Dean is far more than what you know.
Birth and early life. James Byron Dean was born on February 8, 1931 in Marion, Indiana, a small, quiet town surrounded by farmland where life moved slowly and dreams rarely left the borders of the state. His father, Winton Dean, was a dental technician, and his mother, Mildred Wilson Dean, was a warm, imaginative woman who encouraged her son's curiosity. From the beginning, James was different. He wasn't just another boy playing in the fields. He was observant, emotional, and endlessly fascinated by people, how they spoke, how they moved, and what made them feel alive. His mother recognized this spark early on. She was his world, his guide, his comfort, his inspiration. Mildred often read to him, performed small plays together, and filled his young mind with stories of heroes, artists, and dreamers. But this idyllic childhood shattered when tragedy struck. When James was just 9 years old, his mother was diagnosed with cancer. Within months, she was gone. The loss devastated him in ways that would define his entire life. He often said later that her death was the moment his world lost color, the moment he began to understand pain. After her passing, James's father, unable or unwilling to care for him alone, sent him to live with his aunt and uncle, Marcus and Hortense Winslow, on their farm in Fairmont, Indiana. It was a quiet rural community, the kind where everyone knew each other and the days were filled with chores, church, and routine. For a restless, artistic boy like James, it felt both safe and confining.
Rise to stardom, 1949 to 1954. When James Dean left Indiana behind, he stepped not into safety, but into possibility. The dusty roads, the quiet towns, the loss and longing, they were all part of what he carried with him. But in those lean early years, Dean was hungry for transformation, for a world that would see and demand more of him. The journey from Midwestern exile to screen legend began in those restless years between 1949 and 1954. Years defined by ambition, struggle, reinvention, and raw emotional commitment. Dean's arrival in California was almost quiet, but his presence soon became impossible to ignore. Settling first in Santa Monica, he enrolled at Santa Monica College supposedly as pre-law, a concession to his father's expectations. But the pretense lasted only so long. Dean's days were split between lectures and rehearsals. At night, he chased auditions and practiced scenes in corners of studio lots or rented rooms. The dichotomy was immediate: the cautious world his father wanted and the consuming world Dean craved. Soon, he transferred to UCLA and officially shifted to drama. On stage and university productions, he tested himself. He auditioned for Macbeth, playing Malcolm to eager acclaim. Critics later would call his student performances raw and uneven, but already charged with emotional risk. He wasn't polished, he was rugent. Simultaneously, Dean joined local workshops and acting classes outside UCLA. He studied under the guidance of mentors who introduced him to the seeds of what would become method acting. He watched tapes, rehearsed voice, experimented with breathing, internal monologues, emotional recall. He measured himself against standards he barely understood but deeply felt. His peers recalled nights when Dean would disappear from rehearsals, only to return with new insight. His eyes feverish, his face lit by something fierce. By the early 1950s, Dean made a bold choice. He dropped out of UCLA. For him, the classroom had begun to feel suffocating. Books, lectures, technical study, each served purpose, but none carried the immediacy he hungered for. He needed performance to live, not theory. He needed to test himself in real conditions, in spaces where mistakes mattered. So he packed his bags and headed east to New York City, where the theater world loomed large and experimental energy pulsed in small studios, off-Broadway playhouses, and rehearsal rooms with bare floors. He lived in tight apartments, took odd jobs, ate cheaply, and auditioned often. He joined The Immoralist, a stage play that demanded emotional subtlety and confrontation. The role tested limits: desire, betrayal, shame. He poured himself into it, and word spread among theater insiders that a certain intensity flickered in the young actor. The Dean was not just another hopeful, but someone bearing an inner burden.
Fall, the tragic end, 1955. By 1955, James Dean wasn't just a Hollywood actor, he was a cultural storm, a symbol of youth rebellion and misunderstood genius. His image was splashed across magazines, billboards, and the dreams of every young person who felt out of place in a world that demanded conformity. He had the looks of a poet and the soul of a race car driver, sensitive yet reckless, charming yet distant. But as the lights of fame burned brighter, so too did the shadows that followed him. James Dean's love for speed wasn't just a hobby, it was an obsession, a craving for danger that seemed to mirror the turbulence inside him. When he bought the silver Porsche 550 Spider, he nicknamed it Little Bastard. The car gleamed under the California sun, lightweight, aerodynamic, and deadly fast. Friends warned him about the dangers of racing on public roads, but Dean shrugged them off. To him, the car wasn't a machine, it was an escape. Racing is the only time I feel whole, he told one journalist. Hollywood executives hated it. Warner Bros., which had just wrapped up filming Giant, warned Dean that his contract forbade racing during production. But once shooting ended, Dean couldn't resist. He'd already entered several races before, and now, with the Porsche newly customized by George Barris, the famed Hollywood car designer, he was eager to test it on the open road. On the morning of September 30th, 1955, Dean and his mechanic, Rolf Witherich, prepared to drive to a race in Salinas, California. They decided to drive the Porsche themselves instead of towing it, thinking it would be a good way to break it in. That choice would change history forever. The drive began like any other. Dean wore his signature red windbreaker, sunglasses, and a smile. Along the way, he was stopped by police near Bakersfield for speeding, 65 miles per hour in a 55 zone. It was a moment of irony, almost cinematic, considering what would happen just hours later. As they neared the intersection of Route 466 and Route 41, a young man named Donald Turnipseed was driving his Ford two-door eastbound. At around 5:45 p.m., Turnipseed made a left turn onto Route 41, directly into the path of Dean's speeding Porsche. The two vehicles collided violently, a single deafening crash that echoed across the valley. Witnesses recalled the silver car flipping into the air, shattering on impact.
James Dean was, in many ways, the sum of contradictions. He projected rebellion, cool confidence, and cinematic intensity. But underneath, there was a man who carried deep emotional wounds, secret questions, and a life that did not fit neatly into Hollywood's tidy boxes. Even as his fame rose, rumors followed him about love affairs, sexuality, unmet expectations, closeness with friends that people whispered about. Hollywood in the 1950s thrived on image, and Dean's image was too raw, too authentic, too unpredictable, and for that reason, much of his truth was concealed. Some biographers believe Dean was bisexual, noting brief relationships with both women and men. He was known to have several intensely emotional friendships, relationships of passion, longing, and shared secrets. With women like Beverly Wills and Anne-Marie Pierangeli, he had real romantic attachments. At the same time, his friendships with men, William Bast, Rogers Brackett, John Gilmore, were the kind of bonds insiders say blurred the lines between platonic and romantic. Some of these relationships remain unconfirmed, others are whispered in personal memoirs. Rumors persist not because people want scandal, but because they sense a complexity that Dean himself never fully denied. Dean once said, when asked whether he was homosexual, "No, I am not a homosexual, but I also won't go through life with one hand tied behind my back." That phrase, refusing to be bound by label or fear, captured something essential about him. He resisted the roles assigned to him, the pretty face, the teenage idol, the Hollywood heartthrob. He saw those expectations as cages, and he pushed against them. Friends described him as moody and sensitive. He could be charismatic in one moment and withdrawn in the next. He cared deeply about books, philosophy, art, emotion, and yet those around him often felt he was carrying invisible weights. Loss of his mother, conflict with his father, relentless inner longing. They all cooked into his performances, the kind of sensitivity that leaks into every glance, every pause, every scene where he's not saying anything at all, but everything is said. Behind closed doors, Dean was open about pain. In one biography, it's claimed he confided to Elizabeth Taylor that as a young boy he had been sexually abused by his childhood priest, a trauma that left him complicated in intimacy, distrustful of authority, and endlessly searching for truth in connection. Such revelations were dangerous in the 1950s. Hollywood did not tolerate scandal, ambiguity, or vulnerability easily. Studio executives and agents noticed his unpredictability. He refused to give interviews that felt hollow. He skipped photo sessions he felt trivial. He rejected roles that felt inauthentic. Warner Brothers and others tried to mold him, to shape his public persona with the same gloss they gave other young stars. But Dean balked. He wanted identity, not uniformity. Feeling, not perfection.
That tension between being themselves and being commodified became one of the undercurrents of his brief life. The rumors of affairs, of experimentation, of emotional breakdowns, they weren't always substantiated. Some came from gossip, others from friends writing in memoirs, others from overheard moments and letters. But what is true is that for Dean, life was never about scripted safety. He lived far enough out on the limb that when crises came, they broke harder. In Hollywood's rigid world, Dean's resistance cost him. He never fully felt comfortable with the limelight. He struggled to belong, yet deeply wanted connection. He sought authenticity in a realm that valued illusion. And in that struggle, the rumors become part of the legend, not merely whispers, but pieces of a bigger narrative about identity, ambition, longing, and the cost of living without compromise.